Great. Thanks, Jim. And Jose, I have to say that was a really amazing presentation. Um, One thing I did not realize until the presentation was that Hurricane Sandy hit New York exactly 12 years to the day prior to the flooding in Valencia. Um, I have to say, October 29th is a date that unfortunately I remember all too well. Um, so the in the evening of October 29th, 2012, Hurricane Sandy made landfall in New Jersey and pushing storm surge up into New York Harbor, causing significant flooding like the city has never seen. This first image is from Lower Manhattan. You can just begin to make out the skyscrapers in the foreground, and roughly up to 23rd Street in Manhattan. So all of Lower Manhattan, with the exception of Battery Park City, was in the dark as a result of a power outage. And of course, this is an important and kind of striking image. But this really doesn't tell the tale of Hurricane Sandy. New York City is, of course, 5 boroughs. We have 520 miles of waterfront. The damage that was in Lower Manhattan was obviously significant. The economic consequence of that damage was felt throughout the nation and the world. But the story of Hurricane Sandy is much bigger than that. And in fact, Hurricane Sandy itself was a massive, massive storm. This is actual satellite imagery from the storm, and you can see that the storm, in its size, was roughly 600 miles from the eye to the outer bands, and stretched from the Carolinas all the way up to Massachusetts. Just how massive that storm was. In New York City, the impacts of Hurricane Sandy were devastating. 42 New Yorkers lost their lives. 2 million residents lost power, some of whom lost power for more than 2 weeks. 70,000 units, dwelling units, sustained some level of damage. Of those, 800 buildings were destroyed, including 100 buildings in storm-related fires. So during Hurricane Sandy, fires broke out, and because of the winds and the flooding, the fire department was not able to get to those residents quickly, and so many buildings were burnt to the ground. Also, as part of the impact, 4,500 nursing home residents had to be evacuated. 2,000 hospital patients, including newborns, had to be evacuated during the height of the storm. The subways and our car tunnels flooded, and the New York Harbor and the Port of New York and New Jersey were shut down to all boat traffic for a number of days, causing a massive backlog of ships trying to enter the harbor, but also shortages of supplies. And part of that was also gas shortages that lasted for weeks. The state had to ration gas for emergency response for about a week plus after the storm itself. But the size of Hurricane Sandy was obviously significant, as was the amount of surge that pushed into the harbor. So prior to Hurricane Sandy, no storm in the modern record had ever exceeded 10.5 feet. And the reason why that is an important number in New York City is that that's the elevation, or the lowest elevation, of the New York City subway entrances. And so when water came over 10.5 feet, as did during Hurricane Sandy, the floodwaters went into the subway tunnels, causing massive damage to a number of the subway lines, really shutting down the system for many weeks, and ultimately caused stoppages of the service for repairs many years later.
A little bit. Hmm? No, it's fine.
Got a little bit of background noise. In addition, it's important to note that the geology of New York City really defined where the flooding occurred. That combined with the timing of the storm. So, New York, as I mentioned, has a very, very large shoreline. And in fact, the southern portion of the city is on a different tidal sequence from the northern portion. So, the southern portion of New York City, with that fronts on the Atlantic Ocean, has one tide sequence, and it's actually about 6 hours offset with the tide cycle of the Long Island Sound toward the northern portion of the city. And what that meant is that when Hurricane Sandy hit, it just happened to be coinciding with high tide in the southern portion of the city. And so the storm surge was increased by the natural tide cycle. And it was also a full moon tide at the same time. And so that really pushed the water levels up even higher. But the southern portion of the city, of New York City, is also where the glacial outwash was. Going back to the time of the glaciers, the glacial outwash was in the southern portion of the city, meaning that it's at the lowest elevations and the flattest areas of the city, which meant that when Sandy came in, the waters surged rather significantly inland, upwards of a mile inland. As I said, Hurricane Sandy was a very large storm compared to the historic record, but as importantly, it was also significantly larger than what our the active FEMA firm maps, the flood insurance rate maps, suggested at that time. So in 2012, the city was still relying on the FEMA maps from 1983, and that's the FEMA firms are depicted in blue. As you can see, the orange on the slide is the Sandy inundation area, and that went significantly further inland. And so the question is, was FEMA larger than a 1% annual chance storm? Or were the Sandy flood maps significantly underrepresenting what was really the 1% annual chance storm? The answer is probably a combination of both. That the track of the storm was really unprecedented. It when the storm traveled north and got to southern New Jersey, it began to track to the west, which was very unusual for a storm. That pushed the surge right into New York Harbor as a result. That was something that was largely unprecedented for any tropical storm prior. But even though the storm was significantly larger than I think FEMA maps would have suggested, it was not. It is not. It did not come as a complete surprise. In fact, 18 months prior to Hurricane Sandy, the city released Vision 2020, the comprehensive waterfront plan. That was the first document in the city that recognized that we needed to discuss climate change and our coastal resilience as part of our conversation about our use of the waterfront, the development and redevelopment of our waterfront. And goal 8 of that document spoke explicitly about the city's resilience and our coastal resilience. And I should say that after Vision 2020, we had begun to work on resiliency planning, but it was, I would say, proceeding at a rather slow pace. We had received some grant funding to do some work, but to get the attention of elected officials, the general public on the topic was quite the challenge. In New York City, there's always thousands of pressing issues that have to be discussed at any one time, resiliency just being one of those prior to Hurricane Sandy. But it was after Hurricane Sandy that this topic really became quite literally front page news and stayed on that front page for quite some time. One of the challenges that we had, though, about planning right after Hurricane Sandy is that we had to address the very real and immediate housing crisis right after Hurricane Sandy. As I mentioned, there were roughly 70,000 units that had sustained some level of damage. And so rather than have 70,000 New Yorkers potentially without viable housing, the city immediately went into this program, literally within days after Hurricane Sandy, of rapid repairs. And that was a program that provided free emergency heat, hot water, and electric repairs so that homeowners could shelter in place while making more permanent repairs on their homes. Um, and that was an incredibly important and necessary first step, but I would argue also sets the stage for the planning thereafter. Conversations about reconsidering the very nature of those neighborhoods were determined the very first moment that homeowners started putting funding into those homes. Coming out of the rapid repairs program was the Build It Back program, also a city funded program that, as the name implied, was intended to be the 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 city's response for the buildings that had sustained even more damage, and for which we were going to be using federal funds to assist homeowners in the and I should say property owners through property rehabilitation, reconstruction, home elevation, reimbursement for permanent repairs that had already been completed, and to a small extent, acquisition of homes. And one of the challenges that the Build It Back program had in relationship to longer term planning to rethink neighborhoods is that this was largely driven by homeowner choice. And it was an intentional decision that the city made that the Build It Back program was going to be driven by what the homeowner wanted. And if the homeowner wanted to stay in that house, and if they wanted to have, I mean, it was not entirely left to the homeowners because there were federal funds at use, and that they had to uh, abide by federal funding, but it limited. But the homeowner choice oftentimes meant that if a homeowner wanted to rebuild, they were allowed to do so. And of course, that sometimes meant that not only would that home be rebuilt, but it limited the opportunities to rethink the neighborhood as a whole, improve neighborhood infrastructure like stormwater drainage. And so that, again, is one of those moments where a choice that is made early on sets the stage or limits the options for future planning. In addition, in select neighborhoods, the New York State offered buyout programs. And this is the closest that within New York City, we had to retreat after the storm. In three neighborhoods in Staten Island that were largely self-organized. And so it was not the government coming to these neighborhoods and saying, we think you should be bought out, but it was actually organized by the property owners, the homeowners, and the renters in these neighborhoods, that they decided that they have had enough. And Oakwood Beach is, I think, a really good example. That's that middle image, and the image on the right where a home was knocked off its foundation and floated several hundred yards into the marsh. But Oakwood Beach was an area that had sustained flooding in prior storms. And it also had summer wildfires, which is not something you necessarily think would occur in New York City. But because the area was surrounded by wetlands that had turned into Phragmites fields, in the summer, there would oftentimes be wildfires. And so the residents of these neighborhoods really felt that their best option was to not live in this area anymore and to accept a buyout program from the state program. But all of that was happening, those rebuilding efforts and the buyout were happening as the city and state, as well as many, many nonprofits, were undertaking planning efforts as well. So in 2013, it was the year that was literally starting just months after the storm and going into early 2014. there were literally dozens of planning efforts being held throughout the city, and oftentimes right in the same neighborhoods. The city had Plan YC, a stronger, more resilient New York, an effort that I was involved with. The state had the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Plan. I think that could perhaps be best described as a participatory budgeting process to determine how best to use federal funds, as well as numerous nonprofits. This is the cover of a document by the American Institute of Architects New York chapter. But there was a lot being asked of the public to participate in these planning processes within months of the storm. And quite literally, folks were being asked to be involved with planning processes as they were still cleaning out their basements, as they were still trying to find contractors to rebuild their kitchens, etc. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we did at the New York City Department of City Planning that took a slightly longer term track. And that was our resilient neighborhood studies. We studied and were working closely with 10 different neighborhoods for these planning efforts with the real explicit focus on how zoning could be used as a tool to improve resiliency. And several of those neighborhoods, we recognized that the risk in these neighborhoods was different from that of the rest of the city. And in particular, in these neighborhoods where they would be facing daily tidal inundation in the not so distant future due to sea level rise, absent a storm event, which is to say that they would be flooding in blue sky conditions, that we needed to be rethinking the future of these neighborhoods. And where coastal protection was not going to necessarily be a feasible option, we need to rethink what the future of these neighborhoods are. And the step we took in zoning was to establish the special coastal risk district, which is written now into the zoning resolution, which explicitly mentions the exceptional risk these neighborhoods face and really serves, it's an overlay district, but it really serves as the lowest density that we could possibly allow without it being a regulatory taking. And so really proud of this work because it really sets the stage for what comes next, including the work that the city is undertaking now in establishing a permanent buyout program, which is to say that it would be a buyout program that we could use in blue sky conditions or after future events. But to conclude, I want to leave you with just a couple of thoughts. One, there's never a good time to plan when it comes to the nature of these events. In advance of a storm, it is always difficult to get the attention of the public. And in advance of the storm, it's always difficult to get the attention of the public. After the storm, when the public is still pumping out their basements, don't ask them to discuss the future of their neighborhoods. As I mentioned earlier, the first dollar spent determines the path for that homeowner and often the neighborhood. And I think one of the ways we need to be thinking about these types of disasters is the duration of the experience, and that being a very good measure of the impact on those individuals or those neighborhoods. In New York City, obviously quite large. If you were living in Upper Manhattan, so Upper East Side, Upper West Side of Manhattan, Hurricane Sandy may have been a one-night event where your life had to take a pause for 1 month, or excuse me, for one night. Comparing that with residents who had their homes destroyed in the southern portion of the city in particular, or who were without power for months and weeks, if not months, or if you lived in a public housing complex and the elevators were out of service for weeks, if not months. Your experiences of Hurricane Sandy differ greatly, and I think that the duration of that impact is so incredibly important and not something that we discuss frequently enough. But looking forward to the rest of the conversation.